Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to speak to you today on an important Key Ontario initiative in the beautiful city of Halifax. There's lots of beautiful things, and right now, day 2 that we're here, my favorite so far is the ice cream. Just saying. I'm sure there's more that we'll experience over the next couple of days, but right now, that's what it is. So today I'm here to talk to you about what we call mandatory entry-level training. From when our minister made the public announcement about mandatory entry-level training in 2014, the ministry has been working alongside our industry stakeholders to develop this initiative and the requirements and what it would look like. It's truly been a journey with a few bumps along the way, just a few, but with lots of successes. And we worked alongside with our industry stakeholders to ensure that we got it right. We've held a number of sessions with the stakeholders setting out the competencies for commercial truck drivers in developing the new road test and developing the new knowledge test, and then finally the standards that are going to be used for training itself. It's based truly on a partnership that was developed with an industry, and we're quite proud of that. So what I'd like to do over the next hour or so is just take you through the journey with us and really talking about what the drivers were behind the change. And we'd like to refer to that as the yesterday, and this is before mandatory entry-level training, to talk to you about what MELT actually is, how it will work, what it actually means, talk to you about our timing, and then finally what we see the benefits and the goals, so the tomorrow, and what our future actually looks like. So let's start with the yesterday and the drivers. So I'm sure everyone in the room would agree with me when I say that the training and testing and licensing of truck drivers is vital to ensure the safety of everyone on the roads. We are all road users, and that's all important to all of us. And in Ontario, it started with a number of articles focusing on unregistered schools delivering substandard training to commercial truck drivers. And that was followed up with the concern about a road test procedures at a particular drive test location in Ontario. The articles basically claimed that these training schools were teaching commercial drivers to pass the road test as opposed to teaching them to become professional truck drivers. And the industry also indicated their concerns that new commercial drivers did not have the skills and the competencies to become professional drivers. That resulted in October of 2014, the Minister of Transportation, Stephen Del Duca, making a public commitment that Ontario was going to be moving forward with mandatory entry-level training for commercial truck drivers. Another driver, shall we say, for the change was Trucking HR Canada updating the standards for commercial drivers, referred to as the National Occupational Standards, which defines the core knowledge, skills, tasks, for commercial drivers. And this is entry level to what we call occupational, leading to professional truck drivers. And then the last driver noted on the slide is the work currently underway in the United States, who is also looking at mandatory entry level training for commercial truck drivers. What does all this mean in essence? That there's a need for commercial drivers to be properly trained, tested, and licensed. Again, road safety. A little bit more context for you. In Ontario, mandatory training is not mandatory. An individual can choose to take training if they want, and that could be through a registered school. It could also be through an unregistered school, or they can just choose to work with someone to get the skills to be able to pass the road test. In essence, as long as you are 18 years of age, you have a valid license, a passenger license, you pass the medical standards, you pass the vision standards, you pay the appropriate fees, you pass the knowledge test, you pass the road test, you are actually issued a Class A license. So just to give everybody a little bit of context of how it works today in Ontario. So let's talk about mandatory entry-level training and what it actually means. When we started working with the industry and started looking at what mandatory training could be or would be, we realized quickly that we needed to look at a number of key elements. And what we've identified on slide number 7 are just the different components that we actually worked on and are continuing to work on as we develop this requirement. I'd like to say that the successes and accomplishments associated with this initiatives are attributed to the work and the dedication of the staff and the relationship that we established with the industry stakeholders. As I said, we held a number of stakeholder consultations, both in large, with small, even with our drive test location centers as part of the consultations. Some of the key stakeholders that were involved in the discussions were the Ontario Trucking Association, and Jeff is in the room with us today. Under the direction of David Bradley, Truck Training Schools Association of Ontario, as well as the Private Motor Truck Council of Canada. What we heard from our stakeholders in essence is that mandatory training will reduce the overall training costs of industry, since commercial truck driver applicants will receive entry-level training prior to obtaining their license. In essence, this will provide assurances to trucking companies that when hiring new drivers, the individual will have the basic entry-level skills and the additional on-the-job training and experience to become a professional driver. So when we talk about program requirements, in essence, what we're talking about is establishing a baseline for all the training providers and those that are delivering the actual training. And this is, again, about improving the quality of training that's delivered and overall improving road safety. When we talk about the system, this is really about the oversight and tracking of the course completion so that it is not based on, there's no requirement for the training providers to issue a certificate. This is all recorded on the system. Audit and oversight is key to the program to ensure the ability that training providers are delivering the program based on the requirements and that they will be sanctioned if they are not delivering the program according to what has been set out. The training standard is about establishing a provincial training standard that is to be used by all training providers, and then the knowledge in the road test sets out the knowledge and the skills that are required to demonstrate the safe operation of a motor vehicle. So those are just the key elements that we focused on in developing this initiative. So in terms of the program requirements, today there are training can be delivered by the private career colleges that are registered with the Ministry of Training Colleges and University, which is our sister ministry, as well as through the public colleges or through the driver certification program that's governed by the Ministry of Transportation. Moving forward under the mandatory entry-level training, they will continue to deliver the program and they are organizations that are registered with the province. And what it means is, in essence, if an individual wants a Class A road test or wants a Class A license post-implementation, they will be required to complete the MELC course through one of these organizations, and they'll receive the approved training. Training organizations that currently offer the unregulated or what we call the unregistered training will be required to either go through and apply as a private career college or through the Ministry of Transportation if it's an employer-employee relationship under the driver certification program. If you're not registered with one of these or under one of these programs, you will not be permitted to deliver the program. In terms of the course itself, what we have determined is individuals that take the actual course will not be required to take recertification. The course is valid for life. What we also heard from the industry is that there is a need to establish minimum qualifications for the instructors who actually deliver the training program. And we're working through those requirements. There are currently instructor requirements both under the driver certification program as well as under the Private Career Colleges Act. But what the industry felt was that there was a need to establish additional minimum requirements that would be consistent for all instructor qualifications. Over the summer months, we will be working on that policy to finalize that, and we will have that in place prior to final implementation. Individuals that currently hold a Class A license will not be required to complete a course. Because they hold the license, the thought is that there will be no impact to them. The new requirement for new drivers attempting the Class A road test on or after, so our timeline to implement this is July 1st, 2017, full implementation, will mean that anybody that's applying for a commercial Class A license will be required to complete this training course prior to challenging the road test. There's a number of additional policy items that we're going to work through over the summer dealing with reciprocity and whether a condition code should be on a license for somebody that takes a test with a manual transmission versus an automatic transmission, as well as working through some vehicle configuration issues that we've, in terms of the type of vehicle that should be used for the testing. And these items may potentially impact our regulation because we will be moving forward with regulation changes, but the plan is to finalize this prior to implementation of the actual program in July of 2017. In terms of the audit and oversight, audit and oversight is key to ensure consistency in program integrity. We are actually looking at enhancing the current audit requirements as well as I mentioned earlier, the tracking of the course completion. Today, the private career colleges and the driver certification program, as well as the colleges themselves, have that deliver the approved training are audited by the province. These audits will be enhanced to include mandatory entry-level training requirements, again, to ensure consistency across the province and to ensure that the program is being delivered as it's meant to be delivered. Those that are not meeting the requirements will be sanctioned. We are also working towards a system, a web-based system, where applicants who successfully complete the approved course will have their course completion entered into the program. They will then be transferred to the driving record, so when the individual shows up to take their test, it will be confirmed whether they've completed the course, and if they have, then they will be permitted to proceed to take the road test. If they haven't, then they won't be. There will be no need, as I mentioned earlier, for paper certificates from our perspective. So one of the things that you'll hear us talk about is competency-based testing, both on the knowledge and road test front, as well as competency-based training standards that we've developed. As I mentioned earlier, the National Occupational Standards were updated to set out the knowledge and skills or the competencies of a professional commercial driver from an entry level to the occupational. Our focus was and is the entry level skills. We understand that there is more on-the-job training to bring the individual to become a professional driver, but from our perspective, the focus has been entry level. MTO has aligned our training standard to the knowledge test and to the road test, as well as to the National Occupational Standards. And when we talk about competencies, again, we're referring to those knowledge and skills that are required as a commercial driver. And we've defined those as observable, measurable, and attainable. So from an observable point of view, they can be easily observed from the demonstration, the performance, and the application of what's being taught. So you're able to observe them demonstrating the skill set that they have been taught. You're able to measure their learning outcomes in terms of what has been taught. And finally, it's attainable. So they're taught in a way that the learning outcomes are easily attainable through the learning indicators and performance elements, tasks and subtasks that are all outlined in the training standard that's been developed. In February of this year, we were asked to take on the development of the training standard for the mandatory entry-level training program, and I'm pleased to advise that Ontario has developed the commercial driver training standard for Class A drivers. The standard includes minimum requirements that training providers are required to meet or exceed. The training standard was established by a working group consisting of government and industry stakeholders. In developing the final product, we reviewed and analyzed a number of other documents, such as the National Occupational Standards, the Professional Truck Driver Institutes, the PTDI, driver course FMCSA standards, as well as the driver certification existing standards. The new standard is comprised of 4 sections. It has course delivery, it has a curriculum standard, it has a curriculum framework which sets out the learning outcomes with the learning indicators and the performance elements. The goal of the standard, again, is to set high, consistent entry-level training standards for all commercial courses that are delivered across Ontario. So whether you're taking the training in the north or whether you're taking it in the GTA, Greater Toronto Area, the training itself is being delivered as consistent. The new curriculum will be developed based on the 10 common core entry-level competencies that are identified on slide number 14. With these categories, all those learning indicators and performance elements that are mandatory and all those that are recommended. So the way that the training standard has been developed is that there is mandatory components that need to be included in any curriculum, as well as recommended components. And it will be left up to the training provider in terms of whether they want to include any of the recommended components as part of the actual curriculum. In essence, they can go above what the minimum standard that has been set. So what does it actually look like? The training focuses, there's a theme here, on the entry-level knowledge and skills required, and based on the consultations that were conducted, where we landed was 103 minimum hours as the actual training standard for entry-level Class A drivers or Class 1. The classroom component is 36.5 hours. In-yard is 17 hours, and this is essentially around the vehicle where the vehicle's not moving. The in-cab portion of the standard is 50 hours, 32 on-road, 18 hours off-road, and it's essentially, it's 50 hours with 32 on-road and 18 off-road, totaling 103.5 hours. The air brake component of the program is separate. That's an additional 12 hours, and providers can choose to deliver it, and in most cases they do deliver both together, totaling 115.5 hours. So similar to the work that was done on the training standard, we also used a working group with our industry stakeholders to update the knowledge test. Leveraging the work from the National Occupational Standards, again, the competencies were put into knowledge and skills categories, and those that were identified as knowledge are primarily used as our knowledge test questions. Those that were identified as skills were primarily used to develop the road test. We also considered other components such as the PTDI that I mentioned earlier, as well as CCMTA and AMVA's bank of questions. The goal for us was to establish competency-based knowledge tests, again, to ensure that the commercial drivers or those that were applying for Class 1 or Class A license had the knowledge for the class of license for which they were applying, as well as the alignment to the National Occupational Standards. So when it comes to the knowledge test for the Class A license, we looked at 120 national occupational competencies that were identified from the knowledge perspective. As you've heard me say, we had a number of consultations to look at those competencies and then to actually develop the knowledge test questions. So the focus, we've developed 88 new questions in our bank. 12 are specific to truck signs. While the number of the questions really haven't increased from the old to the new, what has changed is that the questions are focused on the competencies that are required for the Class A license or for the Class 1 to pass the actual knowledge test. On the road test front, we again leveraged the information from the National Occupational Standards and those core competencies that were identified as skill-based. The road test entry-level competencies were mapped, so when we started this, we took those entry-level competencies that were identified as skilled and we mapped them to our current road test to identify where the gaps existed, if there were any, based on the competencies that had been identified. We also looked at what our colleagues in other jurisdictions were doing, as well as the AMVA road test. And this led to the development of the new road test, which is similar to the Class Level 2 road test that's delivered today in Ontario. The new road test is more prescriptive than our current test, as it sets out the required maneuvers. So it says that there should be 4 left turns, 4 right turns. It also sets out tasks and subtasks for each of the maneuvers. It also sets out more stringent requirements to ensure that a driver demonstrates the necessary knowledge and skills to safely operate a commercial vehicle. So in essence, today, the individual is scored for a maneuver from start to finish with a few of the tasks listed. In future, each of the subtasks will be specifically listed, driver action, so the individual will be required to demonstrate, as I've indicated before, that they've learned. The driver examiner will then score the individual based on what they see. So it's the observable, attainable, and measurable type of competency that we've talked about. So today they may be scored based on 7 tasks and subtasks. Tomorrow, for the same maneuver, it'll be, for example, 17. The goal, again, is to ensure that the individuals have the necessary skills for the Class A or the Class 1 license, and again, the alignment to the National Occupational Standards. So on slide 19 is the proposed new Ontario competency-based road test. It's divided into 3 parts: the daily inspection, backing, and the on-road driving test. For the daily inspection, Ontario is moving to a randomized test. The expectation is that the individual knows all the schedules and knows what the requirements are for a daily inspection. We, however, are not testing them on a full daily inspection. What we are doing is we are selecting sampling of questions for that to test their knowledge. And it's to determine the applicant's knowledge if the vehicle is safe to operate, which means if there is a defect, is it a major or a minor defect, and what should they do if they find an actual defect. From the backing perspective, there's 2 types that we've identified. That's the offset backing as well as the alley dock. And again, in this particular case, the purpose is to test the basic skills essential for safe control of the vehicle and evaluate the driver's skills in controlling the vehicle, judging the position of the actual vehicle in relation to the objects. We've determined that we're going to give the individual 10 minutes to demonstrate whether they can do the backing, and if they're not able to do it within that 10-minute frame time, they will be disqualified for that particular piece of it. The on-road driving maneuver includes turns, lane changes, intersections, driving along, expressway, curves, emergency roadside. It is to determine and evaluate if the driver has the minimum level of skills to drive in most of the traffic situations. As I mentioned earlier, each of those tasks is broken down into tasks and subtasks, and each is scored for the driver's proper driver action. So that takes us to transition. When we did meet with the industry, what they told us is that there was a period that was required in order for them to be ready for mandatory entry-level training. So later this month, our minister will be making a public announcement with industry stakeholders where we will be releasing the new training standards for implementation in July of 2017. That will mean that our drive test centers will be required to be ready and do what they need to do for implementation in July of 2017. This will mean updating their bank of knowledge test questions, updating their road test routes, providing that information to MTO for review. They will be required to train their driver examiners on the new road test components, as well as the associated changes to the score sheet, because we are developing a new score sheet and a new marking guide. In terms of the actual training providers themselves, so the private career colleges, the public colleges, as well as the driver certification program participants, a school that's unregistered will be required to register with the province, and that will take a period of time from application process. Current private career colleges or public colleges, driver certification will be required to update their curriculum based on the new training standards. As well as we need to take into consideration for public colleges the academic year to implement the changes in terms of when they start. So all that was factored into what we call our transition plan. From our perspective, we will be moving towards finalizing our outstanding policy requirements, as well as working on finalizing the system to track the completion of the course and working through our audit and oversight requirements. We will also approve the routes that are submitted by our drive test providers, as well as the information that's provided to us from the driver certification program, and approve the curriculums or their declarations that are sent in. So what does it mean? At the beginning of my presentation, I showed you the slide in terms of what it looked like today in Ontario. This is what it will look like in July of 2017. In essence, our licensing requirements have not changed. The individual applicant must still be 18 years of age. They must still have a valid license, passenger license or higher, to apply. They must still meet the medical requirements, they must still meet the vision standards, and they must still pay the fees. What's changed is we now have competency-based. They'll be required to complete a new competency-based road test. They'll be required to complete the MELT training course. They'll be required to complete the new competency-based road test, and that will lead them to a Class A license. The introduction of mandatory entry-level training will improve road safety by ensuring that all new commercial Class A drivers are trained to the same minimum standards using what we call using the provincial training standard. They must also demonstrate a consistent skill set and competency to operate a commercial vehicle through updated knowledge and road tests. It will also ensure that all organizations offering the mandatory entry-level training are recognized with the province. It addresses the commercial truck industry's need for qualified and trained commercial drivers, which is what they told us at the outset. Mandatory entry-level training will lead to properly trained and road-ready commercial Class A drivers that will contribute to turning driving into a profession at the commercial level. Ultimately, better trained commercial Class A drivers will result in improved road safety, not only in Ontario but in other jurisdictions. Thank you.